All right, class, I hope you are excited today to learn about the ideas behind the Constitution. We've been talking about the Constitutional Convention and a little bit about that. Well, today what we're going to look at is some of the ideas, where we got the ideas for the Constitution. And I want to start off with a quote by John Adams. And this is something he says. He says when they're talking about writing the Constitution and coming up with government, good government, he says, "Let us search into the spirit of the British Constitution, read the histories of the ancient ages, contemplate the great examples of Greece and Rome, and set before us the conduct of our own British ancestors." And so that's one of the things they do. They kind of look back at history, look back and see what they can learn from history and what they have learned from history. And so we're going to see that. They're also going to learn from their own experiences. And so those are going to be the two big things that we see. We see they learn from the past, and they learn from the ancient past, but then they also learn from the more recent past. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. All right, so let's jump right into it and look at the Roman Republic. And we're going to start off looking at Cincinnatus. And there's a picture of him right there, and that's how I pronounce it. I don't know if it's actually it's probably not the best pronunciation of it. But Cincinnatus is he is kind of this ideal that was really idealized and seen as kind of the ideal leader. He was known for his public service and his civic virtue. And see, the story behind Cincinnatus is that he was from a wealthy family, and through a series of events, anyway, he ends up becoming a small farmer. He's had some leadership in the past, but that's no longer the case, and he is a small farmer because he's had to pay these huge fines for his son, and so he has this small farm, and they just survive off of that, and there's war going on, and he's approached by one of the leaders of the Roman Republic that says, "Hey, we need you to help to fight our enemies," and so he says, "Okay," and he leaves that farm, and he goes and he fights, and he's given the power of a dictator, which is almost complete power, and he has that power, and he goes and he wins, and he returns home, and he resigns. He gives up all that power, and so Cincinnatus is seen as, he did it for the good of the Republic. He did it for the good of his country. He did what he needed to do, but then when it was time to leave, he left. And he is absolutely, George Washington kind of modeled himself after Cincinnatus in many ways, because Washington does the same thing after the American Revolution. Very much aware. It wasn't by just mere coincidence. Washington was very aware of Cincinnatus's example that had been set over 2,000 years prior to that. The other one here is just this whole idea of Roman law, of the rule of law, and what this idea is that we would be a nation of laws, not of men. And we would create laws, and we would follow what the law said, and the law would be based on what was passed and not based on the rule of a king. In a monarchy, the king has, in many monarchies, the king has absolute rule, and what the king says is law. Well, because of our history in England, that was not the case, and that goes all the way back to some of the Roman ideas about law. And so that we get some of those ideas from the Romans, and then that continues on in England. And so that's exactly where we are here. We have traditions of freedom, and we look here at the British experience. And we've got this picture of Jay-Z in front of the Magna Carta at the Salisbury Cathedral in England, one of the original copies that's still around. The principle, two of the key principles that the Magna Carta kind of establishes is this principle that everybody, including the king, was subject to the law, and then all free men had the right to justice and a fair trial. So that was not, that was not universal. It wasn't every person. It was actually a very few number of people. But it's the beginning. It's these early ideas that, hey, people have certain rights. The king has to follow laws. And that goes back to, hey, wait a second. It kind of goes back to those Romans and that idea that there's laws that have to be followed. And even rulers have to follow some of those laws. Another part of our British experience is the English Bill of Rights. It did many things. It upheld the right to a trial by jury. It allowed citizens to bear arms. It affirms the right of habeas corpus. Now, it doesn't exactly establish that. That was actually established prior to this time. But this document, the English Bill of Rights, does affirm that right. There's other rights, but see, these are some of the most important ones, some of the key ones. And habeas corpus, there you can see in the notes there, it says the idea that no person could be held without being charged with a specific crime. So they can't just take you and arrest you and say, we think you're a thief. They have to say, we think you stole this item, therefore we're arresting you. Here's our evidence. And then they have, based on, depending upon how the law is written in particular states, they have so long before they can say, okay, here's the evidence. They have to bring you before a judge and present some evidence to hold you and to continue to hold at you. Otherwise, they could just keep you in jail for a long time, saying, "Well, here we think you did this," but they can't do that, and that's this right of habeas corpus, which is affirmed in the English Bill of Rights. And other traditions of freedom that we have. We have our own American experience, our colonial American experience. A couple of those things are like the Mayflower Compact. Way back in 1620, the Mayflower Compact is signed by those early pilgrims and others that came over on the Mayflower. And this is kind of this idea of the social contract a little bit, this idea that, hey, we're going to come together to work together here. That tradition is certainly alive and well. And then other examples are just the colonial assemblies, like that very first, the House of Burgesses is the first colonial assembly in the New World for the colonies, for the English colonies, and then other colonies as they are settled and created, they're going to have colonial assemblies as well, and eventually more and more people gain representation in these, and this idea of representative government and moving towards representative government, which we talked about earlier in the year. That's absolutely part of the Mayflower Compact and these colonial assemblies. Another one that we've talked about a little bit is the First Great Awakening. Some of these traditions of freedom there. The American experience here, these were preachers that are preaching, traveling around and preaching, and they're talking about all people being equal in God's eyes. Now they weren't simply trying to say, hey, you're just as good as this person or that person. They weren't really necessarily saying that, but what they are saying is that all people are sinners and all people need God's grace, and therefore people kind of hey, if the king needs God's grace just as much as I need God's grace, then we must be in some kind of way, we're equal in God's eyes. And so that's one thing. And so it starts to kind of, this idea of a little more equality is planted. That seed is planted at that time. Another thing that's going on is a lot of these preachers are not a part of some of the established churches, like the Church of England. And many of these states have established church, or these colonies, I should say, have established churches, and they're facing some persecution as they go around. They're being denied a preacher's license. You had to have a license to preach and things like that. In some cases, they're being denied those, or it's being revoked, or they're being run out of town. And so, one of the things they start preaching on is, hey, that people should have the freedom of conscience. They should be able to worship God the way they believe they should. Whatever they think is the right way to worship is how they should worship. This goes back to what we talked about even with Roger Williams way back in the founding of Rhode Island. So the First Great Awakening is going on kind of in the 1730s, 1740s. So Roger Williams was way back in the early to mid 1600s. But it's similar, that same idea. Roger Williams is famous for saying that forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. Well, that's kind of the same idea that they're talking about here. If you don't believe a certain way, you shouldn't, in order to be able to vote or in elections, or in order to fully participate in things and make decisions for your colony, you shouldn't have to belong to a particular church, especially if that church has certain doctrines and beliefs that you don't really believe. And so that's a part of this American experience, and we'll see that these things come out in the Constitution that is being created at this Continental Congress in Philadelphia. All right, so then finally we have, continuing on with this idea of the American experience is the long list of grievances that we have against the English king and Parliament that were expressed in the Declaration of Independence. All those things they were upset about, all the taxes, all the ways they felt like they were mistreated. And so they remembered how that powerful government had power over them and prevented them from really flourishing and trading the way they wanted to and preventing them from creating the way they wanted to create. And so they remembered that powerful government. They ended up creating the Articles of Confederation. We kind of talked about this idea of the Goldilocks principle. The king and parliament were too powerful, controlled them too much, so they swing the other way. They go to the Articles of Confederation, and that current government turns out to be too weak. It doesn't really hold the country together. There's all these problems they're experiencing, whether it's the money is not valuable, or the economy's in shambles, or the government's in debt, and they have no way to create taxes to pay off any of those debts. To the Shays' Rebellion has broken out. The British are not respecting us, keeping troops in forts in the Ohio River Valley. The Spanish are not respecting us. They're no longer letting us use the port of New Orleans. All these problems are going on. And then Shays' Rebellion happens, and they decide, hey, we've got to do something about it. So they remember both of these things. They remember both the Declaration of Independence, prior to that with the king in power, and then the Articles of Confederation, too weak. And so they remember these things, and they end up creating a constitution that many people feel like is a good balance, although some would argue that the Constitution swung back away from a weak Articles of Confederation to a too powerful a government still. So there's differences of opinion whether it was just the right mix of power between the federal government and the states, or whether it made the federal government too powerful. We still have those arguments today. And they also drew just from their experiences as states and as colonies, with creating state governments and having state constitutions. Many of the people that were writing the U.S. Constitution had helped to write their state constitutions, so they knew what they were doing. They had experience with it. And then finally, definitely, last but not definitely least, it's a very important one is this idea of the Enlightenment. This is a kind of a movement, a philosophical movement that takes place prior to this time and in the 1700s. And the two key thinkers here are John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu. John Locke, we've talked about. He writes some papers on government and books on government, and one of the big ideas is found in the Declaration of Independence that we talk about. All people have rights. They're natural rights. Some of those are life, liberty, and property. They have rights to their property, and that government is an agreement between the ruler and the ruled. And this idea is known as the social contract. It's the ruler's job, it's the government's job to protect the people and their rights. When the government doesn't do that, then you have a right to rebel. That's the idea behind the Declaration of Independence. And that's the idea behind the social contract. Well, when they're creating the Constitution, they see this and they say, hey, well, we want a republic where we can elect our representatives. So if they're not doing what we want, we can kick them out of office, vote them out, and bring in new people. Baron de Montesquieu, he has ideas on government. He says, we need powers of government should be clearly defined and divided. So we need to write down what their powers are. Here's the powers that people have, that the government has. Here's what they can do. And then they should also be divided, which means that this principle of the separation of powers. You separate their powers. Instead of the king being like the ruler, he makes the laws. That would be a legislative branch. Kings could, all-powerful kings, they could make a law, and then they could say, you're guilty of breaking that law, and here's what your punishment is. And all the power rests in one person's hand, or one branch in this case, which would be the executive branch. The king is like the executive. Separating those powers out, you've still got those three types of powers, but you separate them out into three different bodies or branches. You've got the legislative branch; they make the laws. The executive branch, it's their job to enforce those laws, and the judicial branch, it's their job to interpret the laws, but also to give justice and administer justice, and that's a very important part of the three branches, and all of them are needed, but you keep them separate. You define what their laws are, their powers are, and so that they don't One branch doesn't become too powerful. And we'll go into more details about this idea of checks and balances and how to make sure you keep those well defined and separated. That is in our Constitution. So that's real quick. Those are many of the ideas where we get the ideas behind our Constitution.